Monster Hunter is a series that has lived rent-free in my head ever since that fateful day in 2010, when my little 12-year-old eyes first locked onto the cover of Monster Hunter Tri for the Wii. When I saw that gorgeous beastie and that brave warrior with a massive sword about to face off in the middle of the games section at Walmart, I just knew that I needed to beg my dad to buy me that game. He said no, but I never forgot that entrancing cover art. I saved up all my lawn mowing money in the hopes that one day it would be mine. After the long and arduous task of scraping together every penny I could for months on end, I finally had the, $20 or whatever it was that I needed to march back into that Walmart and buy my very own copy of Monster Hunter Tri, fulfilling all my dreams of slaying fantastical creatures in a far-off land. I got bored of it and quit playing after an hour or two. It was just too confusing. I didn't know what to do. All the controls were slow and awkward, and all the quests were just to go collect 10 ferns or some other boring crap with no monsters. And when I did manage to find one, it kicked my ass 9 ways to Sunday. I just didn't understand how anyone could enjoy something so monotonous and lame. For the next few years, Monster Hunter slowly faded from memory and found itself among hundreds of others in my ever-growing backlog of games, never to be finished. But a tiny thought, nay, merely an itch, somewhere deep in the recesses of my adolescent mind remained. I was missing something. I had to be. But what? 2013. Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate is released to massive acclaim. Everybody's loving it, and I, now in high school and looking for any reason in the world to put off doing my homework, suddenly remembered the franchise I had once been so excited to immerse myself in. Hell, I'll give it another shot, I thought. Since I was lacking in the funds to purchase a brand new game, and not wanting to spend too much on something I wasn't even sure I'd like, I snagged myself a copy of Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate for the 3DS. It was an updated and improved version of what I'd attempted to get into all those years ago. This time I made a real effort to push myself outside of my comfort zone and learn everything I could before jumping back in. I watched dozens of hours of YouTube tutorials and tip videos, read myself silly through pages and pages of wikis and IGN guides. Anything and everything I could get my greasy little hands on that might help prepare me to become a true Monster Hunter expert. And when the time came to boot up that cartridge once again, I realized it really wasn't all that complicated. I think I could have spent about a quarter as much time researching and still have been fine. There was certainly a lot to figure out, but the Ultimate version did a way better job with giving you decent tutorials than the OG version did. After a few hours spent figuring things out, it just clicked, and all of a sudden I found myself having lots of fun hacking away at larger-than-life monstrosities and harvesting their carapace to make cool hats and big swords. Reflecting on this experience of being really excited about something, then bouncing off in disappointment when it was too convoluted and not what I thought I wanted, only to revisit it years later and realize that there was something to love about it after all, made me want to make a video breaking down some of the expectations that new players might have coming into this series, and reframing some of those expectations to help people take these games for what they are, rather than what you think you want them to be, and hopefully giving at least a few of you the boost you need to push through Monster Hunter's notorious learning curve and fall in love with it the same way that I have. For this video, I'm going to focus on the 3 main hurdles of expectation that initially prevented me from getting into the series, and how I was able to overcome them. Number 1. These aren't action games in the vein of Devil May Cry or God of War, with their snappy, fast-paced combos and responsive animation canceling. They're RPGs, with weighty, committed attacks and evades. They have mere simulation levels of dependence on preparation and strategy, at least in the older games. Newer entries have streamlined this aspect quite a bit, but combat is much more about positioning and timing than it is about flashy combos or raw DPS, although DPS is still a factor. Targeting weak spots and using things like the environment or monsters' behavior to your advantage is key. You really have to pay attention to the way your foe behaves and moves, not only learning their moveset and attack patterns so you can properly evade, but also learning to recognize when they're tired so you can follow them back to their den and bomb them in their sleep, or when they're hungry so you can set out a hunk of poisoned meat, or keeping an eye out for limping so that you know you're getting close to victory. All of these things really bring the monsters to life in a super engaging way that forces you to get to know your prey. Unlike a lot of action games, or even other RPGs, enemies aren't lifeless punching bags getting in your way. They're the entire point of the game, and solving the puzzle that each monster presents is a huge draw of the combat here. Letting go of how I was used to engaging with melee combat in games, and embracing what made Monster Hunter unique was a truly essential shift in perspective that made me want to delve deeper into the combat and get really invested in mastering the moveset of my chosen weapon, along with optimizing all my gems and armors to take down colossal creatures as fast as possible. And that leads me to number 2. These are some long-ass fights. Some of these can take nearly an hour to finish. This idea of an hour-long boss fight was another thing that drove me away from the series at first. I mean, think about how intense the boss battles in Soulsborne games are. They require constant focus and laser reflexes, and the encounters here are much the same. But while the Souls bosses might feel like they go on forever, even the longest battles in those games only take 2 or 3 minutes at most. Monster Hunter absolutely dwarfs that, but I believe thinking of these hunts as boss fights is the wrong approach. In truth, these encounters are what you do for the vast majority of your time in game, and they're designed in such a way as to provide the same ebb and flow of action and exploration as a more standard level would in any other game. You begin most hunts at a safe camp, where you can stock up on special items, cook a meal, and take a moment to plan out your approach. From there, each game has you go about tracking down your prey in a different way. For this video, we'll focus on the way it's done in Monster Hunter World and Iceborne, since that's going to be the most accessible option for most people these days, being available on nearly all modern systems. The game uses a system called Scout Flies, which will lead you to little clues about your monster's whereabouts, like footprints, scratch marks, and leftovers from its last meal. Once you collect enough of these, they'll guide you toward the monster itself. By doing this a lot, you can raise your research level for that specific monster, and eventually the flies will take you right to it from the start without you needing to look for clues first. Upon encountering your target, combat begins. Some monsters will attack you on sight and others will ignore you until you make the first move, but either way you're going to be in a fight. This is where all the stuff I talked about in my last point comes into play, and you have to read your opponent and keep pace with its level of aggression. Monsters usually have a default pace when it comes to how often they use certain moves or chain combos together, which is then modified as certain thresholds are met. Do enough damage and they'll get angry and become enraged, which means faster attacks, more frequent super moves, and less time for you to breathe. But, just like you, these creatures have limited stamina, and getting too aggressive means they'll be left tired and in need of a break. In this state, they'll begin to drool and become more sluggish. Sometimes they'll stop moving to catch their breath, or a super move will simply not work. Eventually, the monster will run away, either to get a quick bite to eat, take a nap, or just get some space, and you'll have to track it down again. This will happen multiple times over the course of an ordinary hunt, giving you the chance to sharpen your weapons, eat a snack, gather some materials, or reapply buffs before jumping back into the fray. And because of this mechanic, battles will end up taking you to different areas all over the map, rather than taking place in an enclosed arena like most boss fights in other games. This means the whole world is still accessible to you, including other large monsters that you can goad into fighting the one that you're hunting, doing a ton of free damage and playing out with a cool, unique animation most of the time called a turf war. All these factors, and some others like sleep bombing and environmental traps, lead themselves to an experience with much more diversity and range in terms of pacing and activities than you would get in, say, a Souls boss, where you're locked in a room with a big monster and you're just dodging and slashing, or casting spells if you're a nerd, until one of you is dead. That's not to say that this approach is objectively better or anything, but just that it has so much more going on that it justifies its extended length in comparison, and gives it a feeling more akin to an action-packed level than it does to a standard boss fight. And finally, the last big thing that served as a huge barrier to my initial enjoyment of the series is number 3, the need to repeat fights over and over again. Monster Hunter's core gameplay loop can be broken down like this. You collect materials so you can craft equipment, so you can collect cooler and harder to get materials, so you can craft even better equipment, which will allow you to collect even rarer materials, and so on and so forth, over and over again until the end of time. Or at least for as long as you're willing to keep doing it. And a big part of getting the best equipment involves hunting the same monster many times over, hoping it drops the right materials for you to craft that new helmet or sword you've been after. This was a huge turnoff for me at first. I just spent an hour taking down this crazy difficult dragon. I barely scraped by, and you're telling me that I have to do it all over again if I want it to be worthwhile? Well, yes, kind of, but it's not as annoying as it sounds, I promise. Let's go over the process of crafting, say, a new sword. We'll need X number of specific parts that drop from a certain monster or monsters in order to make a weapon that takes on the attributes of said monster, like poison or electricity or just raw strength, whatever. So naturally we need to hunt that monster, and upon winning we get a selection of random parts from that monster as a reward. Every part has a set % chance of dropping, and better items are less likely to drop. Sometimes you'll get lucky and end up with all the parts you need after a single fight, especially really early on when you can only craft pretty basic stuff. But most of the time you're going to need to fight that monster at least a couple more times to get everything you need. When I first started playing, this was a problem for me. Since the combat still hadn't clicked, I hated the idea of struggling to beat what I was thinking of as a very difficult boss fight, only to realize I had nothing to show for my efforts unless I did it again, maybe several times. Now, I personally think that the combat on its own is fun enough and the roster of monsters is varied and deep enough for replaying fights to be worth doing for its own sake. But if fighting just for fighting's sake and happening to be rewarded with potentially useful items afterward just doesn't do it for you, then I totally understand. In your case, I think it might be helpful to reframe the way you view the loot system. Although I consider these games to be RPGs, they don't have the typical experience-based progression system. Your character never gets any stronger over the course of the game, they just get better gear. The only one who actually improves is you, the player. Your character might not level up or gain any additional strength or dexterity, but you do. Metaphorically speaking, of course, I wouldn't recommend skipping the gym just because you got better at Monster Hunter. Still though, as you learn to master your weapon and figure out all the deep and complex systems to do with crafting and hunting and engaging with monsters, you'll slowly become more and more adept until you can demolish anything in your path, even with crummy gear. And this brings me back to the loot system. At first it seems like a replacement for XP. You beat monsters, they drop parts make weapons and armor and charms, and those make your stats higher. On the surface that's all true, but thinking of the loot as a janky version of experience points that takes several long fights to actually be useful is detrimental to your enjoyment of what the game is trying to do. You don't have to grind the same monster over and over to get through the game. Most fights will result in enough drops to make at least something on the first go round, and that'll probably be enough to get you through without any grind, at least on your low rank playthrough. What the loot system is there to do is reward you for finding a monster that you love to fight and giving yourself over to learning its intricacies and devoting the time to mastering it. Why you want to do this is up to you. Maybe you love the design, or the spectacle, or the feeling of fighting it alongside your friends. Every monster is someone's favorite for one reason or another, and when you find yours, you're going to want to fight it again and again. And that's where the loot system comes in. Now that enthusiasm for mastery is rewarded by giving you the parts you need to augment your hunter in the image of your favorite monster, granting you abilities and resistances and strengths to mirror the creature that you've now put so much time into truly learning. And now, newly equipped, you'll be ready to do it again when the next monster that invokes your passion for the hunt comes along. You don't have to grind for a full set of armor and weapons for every monster to make it through the game. And unless you're going for a really high-level endgame build, you don't really have to grind that much at all. But when you do decide to dive into that grind, the loot system is really only there to reflect in-game the progress that you've made in real life as a player. In short, the game rewards you for really getting into it, without punishing you too much for wanting to play casually. At least the newer games. The older ones will make you grind and there's nothing you can do about it. But hopefully, if you decide to go back to those ones, you've already discovered your passion for the satisfaction of the grind. Well, those were the major roadblocks to my monster hunting career and how I overcame them through a change in perspective. What'd you think? Have you experienced any of these, and did my suggestions help at all? Or maybe it was something else that made you bounce off of Monster Hunter. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, how you got into the series or why you haven't been able to. Either way, thanks so much for watching. It really means the world to me, and I hope you consider dropping a like and maybe subscribing to see more videos like this in the future. I've been Greg, and this is Big and Stuff. See you next time.